connected to Marshall Linehan many, many years ago, and at some point he'll tell you a cute story about how he actually met Marcia, and it certainly fits Marcia's charisma. But Alan also is, in addition to his work, is also the Director of Research for our organization and is always there when we have any question and always there to give us advice, and also is the co-creator, along with myself and some wonderful family members who are here, of our Family Connections program. So we're delighted to move into now our Young Investigators Award, and please welcome Alan Frazzetti.
Okay, thank you, Perry. And this is really, I don't know what happened to that, but there it is. A really fun part of the weekend for me. I'm delighted to be able to introduce our winners for the Young Investigator Award. Just a little background. A number of years ago, we decided, as many of you know, that there's actually a paucity of research in borderline personality disorder. This has been true for a long time, and one of the things we thought we might do to create some interest in younger researchers moving into this research in this area is to highlight their achievements. And there actually turns out to be, some really interesting things going on. And so we created a Young Investigator Award. Now, young in this particular case has nothing to do with actual chronological age. It has to, although they are typically young, as you will see, but actually has to do with how long they've been in the field. So it's really within 5 years of their terminal degree, the end of their training. So these are really young folks, and they've done a fantastic job. So I want to just, first of all, this year say we had an absolutely stellar group of people applying for this award and being nominated for this award. But I'm very pleased to have 2 runners-up here, or honorable mentions. I'm not exactly sure what we called you, but I just want, if you could just stand up and wave. One, and I'll do these just alphabetically, Bernadette Grosjean is currently UCLA, and David Klonsky, there he is, and you're at Stony Brook, yeah? Yeah, Stony Brook. So their work is fantastic. I don't have time to tell you about all their backgrounds. And then our second place person is Dr. Nicholas Rush. Where are you, Nicholas? Please stand up. Come up here. Come down here. Dr. Rush got his MD degree from the University of Freiburg. Is that right? And did a specialization both in neurology and in psychiatry.
Well, I did 1 year of neurology.
Yeah, both. And now you're a fellow at the Marie Curie International Fellow at the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. And so it's with great pleasure I present you with this award, and probably even more importantly, money. So, congratulations. He's a lot taller than I am. And it gives me an enormous amount of pleasure to introduce to you our next speaker, and the first place winner for this year's Young Investigator Award, Dr. Alex Chapman. Alex, why don't you come on up here? Dr. Chapman did his PhD work at Idaho State University, where he graduated just 4 short years ago. Did his residency at Duke University and a postdoc at the University of Washington. Is now an assistant professor at Simon Fraser University in Canada, in Vancouver, BC. Yeah. And what else do I want to say about Alex? Alex has just been a powerhouse of research in the area of BPD. Alex, at his young age, already has more than 30 publications and 2 books. So I think you should be giving this award to somebody instead of getting it. But anyway, so it's my pleasure to give you this award and some money. Congratulations. Wonderful work. That's good. And you're up. Great.
I feel very honored to get this award. I must say I was impressed with, when I saw the list of people that I was competing with, I was impressed, and I obviously am in incredibly good company. And so I feel honored to get the award and to be invited to talk about my research at the conference. This is really the first NEA-BPD conference that I've been to, but certainly won't be the last. It was incredibly interesting watching the panel and the other talks, and I certainly plan to show up again in the future. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my most recent research on borderline personality disorder. And I was going to come up here and talk about my dissertation, but I have to say I've talked about that about 6 or 7, 8, 9, 12, 11 times. And I decided to talk about something a little bit different, which is the latest stuff that I've been doing. And actually, it's very fitting to what was just talked about with the treatment roundtable that we just had. And I hope you'll see why that is. So one of the things that I think most of us would probably agree, now I have to say just up front that I'm a DBT person, but I think that most of us would agree that people with borderline personality disorder, people who struggle with BPD, have trouble managing their emotions. I think most of us would probably agree that at times, I mean, how many of us would disagree with the idea that at times people with BPD have trouble dealing with their emotions? All right, no hands? Okay, good. So that's something that we generally would agree on, right? And there's another thing a little bit later on in this talk that I think we also would generally agree on that we'll talk about. But there's actually been not a whole lot of research on that has actually directly looked at emotion regulation in BPD. Now, I know it probably sounds surprising because this is such a big part of most of the way we think about it, but there's not been a lot of research. There's been a lot of research on, well, are people with BPD more emotional than people without BPD? All right, so here's the surprise. Yes, indeed they are, right? And so in some studies. In other studies, it's a little bit more mixed, but for the most part, yes. Okay, so but how many people have actually looked at the effect of regulating your emotions in different ways among people with BPD? Not very many. How many people have actually looked at whether people with BPD, either in the laboratory or in real life, can actually regulate their emotions better or less well than people without BPD? Not too many. So one study that was recently done by a colleague of mine, Kim Gratz, who actually won this award 2 years ago, looked at this more directly in the laboratory and looked at basically, sort of like Alan was talking about before, got people to do a really stressful task, basically an impossible neuropsych task that involves adding numbers, and it really stresses people out. I've actually tested this out in my lab, and I've gotten my research assistants to do it, completely stressed them out too. And so what they did was they got people to do this neuropsych stressful task, and the goal was if you do really well on this stressful task, then afterwards, that determines how much money you can win later on when you do another task afterwards. And so what they did was they looked at how many people quit the task early. And people with BPD tended to be more likely to quit the task, and they were more likely to quit the task earlier than people without BPD. Now, what does that suggest? Well, one part of having trouble regulating your emotions is not being able to keep going despite distress. Not being able to kind of keep going and pursue a goal of some kind despite the fact that you feel upset. And so that was one study that actually showed that a little more directly. Another study was the one that we just did a little while ago in my lab, where we looked at, and this was, of course, this was looking at relationship between BPD features and scales on a self-report measure called the Difficulties in Emotion Regulation Scale. And we found that people who were high in BPD features were much more likely to score higher on pretty much all the scales on this measure, except for the one that measured emotional awareness. And so that was an interesting finding. Another part of this research has looked at impulsivity. So one of the things that some people think is that this tendency to react quickly without thinking, which is impulsivity basically, is related to, is sort of an indicator of how much trouble a person has in regulating emotions. And so we looked at that in a laboratory study where we checked out how well do people learn to stop their behavior in order to avoid being punished. And, you know, we weren't like shocking people or throwing water on people or anything like that. We were actually, you know, they would lose a small amount of money, like 10 cents, if they committed the wrong response. And we found that people on that laboratory task who were high in borderline features were more likely to be more impulsive than people who were low in borderline features. And that held up even after we controlled for things like how many psychiatric symptoms do they have in general. And so it seems to be something that's fairly unique to BPD. All right, so what do people with BPD do to regulate their emotions in general? I mean, what do most of us do to regulate our emotions? In most cases, when we're really upset, we probably want to avoid or escape them to some degree, right? So what's the number one reason why people say that they hurt themselves? What do you think? To do what? Why do people hurt themselves? To feel something? Pardon me? To relieve stress. Yep. So some people report that they hurt themselves to feel something if they're feeling nothing. Or some people report that they do it to punish themselves. Other people report they do it for other reasons. But the number one reason why people say they hurt themselves is in order to escape or avoid emotions. And so this is how I think that avoidance seems to work in borderline personality disorder and in other disorders, of course, as well, right? And so there's emotional distress of some kind. So some stress happens. There's some upsetting event in the environment. Now, you can think of this as, let's say the patient is waiting for 3 minutes for Frank to show up. So I'll use Frank's example because it's a nice one. So let's say that the patient is stressed out by Frank and is waiting for 3 minutes for him to show up. And then there's some kind of, and then what happens is that there's this attempt to avoid or escape the emotions that come up. Like the emotions that come up might be shame, sadness, disappointment, anger, etc. And there's this immediate attempt to avoid or escape. Now the problem is that the problem behaviors actually work incredibly well. So some of you have had direct experience with this, that unfortunately self-harm actually works to make people feel better. Unfortunately, drug use, binging, all those things actually work quite well to help people feel better. And so what this does is it actually leads to escape. Of course, driving away in the car, like getting away from Frank also makes people feel better as well, apparently. And so that actually makes it so that people get trapped in this little cycle where they're learning that problem behaviors actually make them feel better. And what happens the next time they feel distressed? They're going to engage in the problem behavior because it made them, I mean, why on earth wouldn't you do something that works? If you don't have anything else that works, why not do something that works? And so that actually, it locks people up. I really like this little, I have to say I stole this slide from somebody else, but I like the little chain analogy. It's like you're locked up. It's like you're chained to the problem behavior. It's like you're stuck to it. And so this is how I think avoidance seems to work in BPD, or escape. And so what we did in a previous study was we actually looked at avoidance in BPD. So we had, we looked at incarcerated women who were in prison in southeastern Idaho. Okay, so if you think your life is going bad, at least remember you're not in prison in southeastern Idaho. All right, so nevertheless, we looked at we had 105 female inmates in prison in southeastern Idaho. About 35% of them had BPD. BPD was related, so the higher your scores on the BPD measure, and we looked at diagnosis as well, the more likely you were to say that you avoid your emotions, that you suppress your thoughts, and that you use avoidant coping strategies. Like you do things like deny that you have the emotion in the first place, or ignore the fact that you have the emotion, and that type of thing. Thought suppression, which is you have a thought that you don't want, and you decide that you're not going to experience it, you're going to just bottle it up and not hear it, and just ignore it. That was related to self-harm among people with BPD, but not among people without BPD. So the higher the thought suppression, the more likely people with BPD had self-harmed a lot, but that wasn't the case with people without BPD. And others have looked at this in BPD as well, have looked at avoidance in BPD, and it tends to be related to the greater severity of symptoms or experiences related to BPD. So the bottom line is that avoidance does seem to play a role. People with BPD, they avoid more, and their avoidance actually messes them up. It actually makes them have more severe, it might actually make them have more severe symptoms, and it might be related to self-harm. So what's the alternative? All right, so one alternative, as Alan talked about, this is actually another commonality, I think, across these approaches that we're talked about, is that one alternative could be, instead of avoid, why not step back and watch or notice or observe, right? So maybe this is a reasonable alternative. It's certainly something that pops up in Frank's work in TFP. It pops up in Jeff's work in schema-focused, and it certainly pops up in DBT. It's one of the big strategies that we teach in DBT to help people manage their emotions. And so instead, maybe this is what could happen. Maybe the emotional distress happens, and then maybe you could step back and just observe your emotions and let them come and go. Maybe that's actually a reasonable thing to do. And then that gives people room, instead of in acting impulsively and doing impulsive things, to step back and think, well, what's actually going on here, and what can I do, right? And it could certainly be helpful in Frank's work. What's going on? Where is this reaction coming from in the first place? Or in Jeff's work, or in DBT as well. Observing is probably not a bad thing to do no matter what treatment you're getting. And that actually makes it so that instead of distress avoidance, maybe what will happen over time is that if this really works for people, it'll be distress, observe, and instead of engaging in the problem behavior. So there's been a few lines of research that suggest that this is actually this could be an effective thing to do for people with BPD. One is certainly that DBT works, right? So there's been a lot of studies on DBT suggesting that DBT works, and mindfulness, or observing your emotions, observing experiences, that's a big part of DBT. It could be that it works, like I say, by interrupting impulsive behavior. If you're observing, you're not acting on your emotions. And there's been experimental research that suggests that if you're a person who really tends to avoid your emotions, you're actually probably better off observing them than suppressing them. So what's very interesting, I'm just going to talk about one of these, was the Feldner Study, where basically what they did was they got people to go in the laboratory and they gave them a very upsetting event that was uncontrollable. They made them inhale carbon dioxide, which makes you feel like you're not getting enough air. And they got people to either suppress their emotions, so to bottle them up, clamp down on them, or to observe their emotions. And for those people who were high in avoidance, they tended to do better when they observed their emotions than when they suppressed their emotions. And so this may suggest that, again, that perhaps people with BPD are better off observing than suppressing. Now, what's the problem with this research? It's really interesting, but what's the big problem is that we really don't know what happens when we transport this laboratory stuff everybody's doing into the real world of people who are struggling with these problems. And so what we need is some method of transporting what's happening in the laboratory research into daily life. And that's what the study is all about that I'm going to talk about. We actually did a little bit of this, transplanting what happens in the laboratory to the real world. No study has actually looked at, well, when you tell somebody to observe your emotions, to observe their emotions, what actually happens to them in their daily lives, in their day-to-day lives, as they're coping with whatever stress they're coping with. What actually happens? And so we did a little bit of a study on that. So we directly looked at the effect of suppressing emotions versus observing emotions in daily life in the natural environment. And for this study, we used what's called an Analogue Bpd sample. So we used college students who were high in borderline personality features. And so for this study, it was really like what we were thinking about it as was a preliminary study. We were going to start off with college students who are high in BPD features, and what we're going to do is we're going to move into getting data from people in the community who have BPD or people who are in treatment. Now, that's not to say that college students are a problem-free group, right? So the rate of, I was talking with Alan about this last night, the rate of self-injury among college students, does anybody know what it is? It's incredibly high. It's in some studies they find between 20 and 40, up to 50%. So college students are not out of the woods as far as problems go. We also know that they drink a lot, and that there's quite a number of college students who are high in borderline features. So there's a researcher at the University of Missouri named Timothy Trull, who does a lot of research on college students with borderline features, and has found that having BPD features in college, not surprisingly, makes it difficult to succeed academically, and it makes it difficult to navigate the whole process, makes you more likely to drop out. Now, on the other hand, if I was living in Missouri, I might be emotionally dysregulated too. So maybe that's a really good place to actually do this study. So what we did was we got people who were high on BPD features versus people who were low on BPD features. And we ended up with 39 low BPD people and 30 high BPD people. The majority were female, as you might suspect, in a college sample of people who actually agree to participate in research, and Chinese Canadian. There were lots of Chinese, because I'm in Vancouver, BC, and there's a huge Asian population there, and so we had a very interesting sample, a little more diverse than you would expect in other places. What did we do to these poor people? Okay, so we got them to monitor their emotions and their urges, so their positive and their negative emotions, and their urges to engage in impulsive behaviors like self-harm, binging, drug use, and that type of thing over the course of 4 days. We also got them to monitor whether they did any self-harm, whether they did any drug use, binging, or any of a number of different behaviors. Some of the other ones on the list were going to sleep in order to escape emotions, or driving recklessly, or doing other types of things that are impulsive actions to deal with emotions. We randomly assigned them to start on Thursday or Saturday because we figured that students would actually feel a little bit differently if they're doing this during the week versus on the weekend, so we wanted to get the whole spectrum of the days of the week. And on day one, we told them repeatedly, actually, what you want to do on day one is just do whatever you normally do when you experience your negative emotions. So this is just a baseline day. On day two, we asked them to observe their emotions. So basically to just notice them, just watch them as they come and go, and don't do anything else with them. Just simply observe, notice, and watch them. On day three, we got them to suppress their emotions. Now, we didn't use the word suppression. We just basically said, do whatever you can to not experience whatever emotion you're experiencing. Don't let yourself feel your emotions, and act in a way that nobody around you could tell that you're feeling the emotion that you're feeling. And then on day four, we got them to observe their emotions again. And so this was just preliminary. We're going to change around the order in which we do this, but just as the very first study we had, this was our order. We figured it would be actually good to end on observe, because if suppression gets people really upset, maybe they'll be better off if they observe for a day and they'll be more safe. But as you'll see, we had some findings that were actually very different and very interesting. One of the very first things we looked at was, is this actually a feasible thing to do? Like, can we get people to monitor their emotions? You know, we had people monitoring their emotions 8 times a day from the time they woke up to the time they went to bed, pretty much every hour and a half, and responding to all these questions. Like, we had 65 questions they had to respond to. And we weren't sure whether this was really going to work out. And so we found that actually quite a number of people, like 95%, understood our instructions quite well. They responded to a mean of about 80% of the beeps. And so that's not actually too bad. If you're getting beeped about 8 times a day and you respond to 6 or 7 beeps a day, you're actually doing fairly well. I did this myself as we were in the pilot phase, like when we were testing out whether we could use these Palm Pilots and they were going to work. I had them with me for weeks on end, and they were beeping me 8 times a day. And I'm actually surprised. I don't think my rate was 80%. I was probably lower than 80%. For those of you who do this kind of research, definitely give me an email, because we worked out all the problems you could possibly work out with Palm Pilots and how to deal with them. How many of you have Palm Pilots in here? All right, so you know that sometimes they crash, sometimes they don't work, sometimes the batteries run out. So I went for weeks, I would say, like having this Palm Pilot beep me 8 times a day, and sometimes it would beep me and it would say fatal alert. And I was like, no, we want to run subjects in 2 weeks. We can't do this. We can't have people out there and have fatal alert. I mean, if we want to get people upset, that's probably a good way to do it, but then we'll get no data from them. And so what we also did was, so these were the outcomes, as I say, that we looked at. So we looked at positive and negative emotions, and we looked at urges to engage in these behaviors, and we also looked at the behaviors. Now, before we started the study, we thought, okay, so I've been saying that observing is going to be a good thing and suppressing is probably not going to be such a good thing. Before we started this study, we thought it could go the other way. So it could be that people with BPD, if they suppress their emotions over a fairly short period of time, they may actually end up better off, because number one, they're used to it and they're good at it. And number two, it might be better than engaging in self-harm and other types of behaviors. They may actually feel better without doing the impulsive behavior. So maybe it's not going to be such a bad thing. We also thought it's possible that for people who are low in BPD, if they normally cope effectively, and now we're saying do this maladaptive thing to cope, they may actually end up more upset. And so there's these two competing possibilities, and so I'll tell you what we actually found. For negative emotions, we found that you can see on the graph that the beige is the suppressed day, the green is the observed days, and the blue is the baseline day. And what we found for low BPD people is, not surprisingly, they generally reported fewer negative emotions, like lower intensity of negative emotions over the 4 days, right? That wasn't surprising, of course, but it kind of reinforces what we all think about how we conceptualize BPD. What we found, though, was that they were more upset on the suppressed day than they were on any of the other days. So this is the low BPD people. They were upset, basically, by suppressing their emotions. It seemed to have an effect on them. For the high BPD people, that wasn't the case. None of these differences are significant that you can see between those three graphs, those three bars. But the low BPD people were more upset on the suppressed day. For positive emotions, we found that the high BPD people were actually higher in positive emotions when they suppressed their emotions, their negative emotions, than they were on any of the other days. And there was no effect on positive emotions for the low BPD people. They didn't feel any more positive or any less positive when they were suppressing their emotions. The other thing that we found that was interesting was that among the high BPD group, as you can see, their urges to engage in the impulsive behaviors were actually lower on the suppression day than they were on the other days. And that wasn't the case for the low BPD people. There was a slight trend for their urges to be slightly higher, actually, but it wasn't significant. And so, but of course, what we found too was that the low BPD people had lower urges in general to engage in these impulsive behaviors, which is what we would have expected. All right, so again, just to summarize, the primary findings were that for low BPD people, when they suppressed their emotions, they had higher negative emotions. For high BPD people, when they suppressed their emotions, they had higher positive emotions and lower urges to engage in impulsive behavior. Just a couple of secondary findings was that, as I say, in general, people who are high in BPD had higher negative emotions and higher urges to engage in the impulsive behaviors. And there was actually another finding that was interesting that one of my students is working on right now. We got people to report what they were doing, like what situation they were in, just as the thing beeped. And so we had this big, long list of different situations. And some of them were negative or stressful situations, like failure, being rejected, being alone, having prejudice, and those types of things. And we found that for people who were higher in BPD, there was a stronger relationship between being in a stressful or negative situation and having urges to do impulsive things. And there was also a stronger relationship between being in a stressful or negative situation and feeling a negative emotion. And so this is something we're going to follow up in with a deeper look at the data. But basically what this suggests is that it could be that people with BPD are more sensitive to the context that they're in. That they're actually, if they're in a stressful context, they're more likely to feel negative emotions and more likely to feel urges. All right, so some of you might be wondering, okay, so what about, when people are asked to suppress their emotions, why don't you all try this for just a minute? So just for a minute, just notice any kind of emotions that you're feeling right now, whatever it might be. So you might notice that your heart is beating, or you might notice that you've got muscle tension, or that you feel a sinking feeling in your stomach. You might notice that you feel calm. All right, so just for a minute, do whatever you possibly can not to feel the emotion that you're feeling right now. All right, act in a way that nobody could tell you're feeling it, whatever it is, and do whatever you can to not feel it. Just for I'll tell you when to stop. So start now and I'll tell you when to stop. Okay, go ahead and stop. Now, how many of you did that? What did you do? Is anybody willing to share what you actually did? Yeah. You concentrated on something else. Okay, exactly. So how many of you concentrated on something else? Right, almost everybody who did this. And so what we were thinking was it distraction? Was it that when people with high BPD suppressed their emotions, they were actually distracting themselves by thinking about other things that made them have more positive emotions, perhaps? It doesn't seem to be the case. High BPD people distracted more all throughout the whole study, but this wasn't just on the suppressed day. And so if it was really distraction, I would expect that it was going to be only on the suppressed day that they would distract more, not necessarily across all the days. So it doesn't seem like it was just distraction, although it's something we need to work on a little bit more for our future study. Was it because they had more psychiatric symptoms in general? No. So we controlled for that, and we found out that we still got the exact same effects. And so it seems like it's actually very unique to BPD. Was it because they generally tend to avoid their emotions, and maybe they're better at it, which is what we sort of thought beforehand? It doesn't seem to be the case, because we controlled for avoidance, and we still found the same effects. Was it the length of time? I think this is actually probably the most likely explanation, was that we really only had people suppress their emotions for about 24 hours. And I'm actually thinking that if you chronically suppress your emotions, you're probably going to end up worse off than if you just suppress your emotions for short periods once in a while. And so short periods doesn't seem to be so bad, but if you actually are a chronic suppressor of your emotions, that can probably have negative effects. So what we're going to do is follow that up in a future study. Order I'm not going to talk about, but the other thing that we thought is that asking people who are generally effective in coping, like the low BPD people who generally reported effective coping strategies, asking them to do something maladaptive that might be foreign to them, like, well, why would I suppress my emotions? I normally deal with them quite well. It could be that that actually makes them more dysregulated. So what's interesting is that we may have found a good way to get people who effectively cope more dysregulated. And so that could be useful in future research, of course. We also looked at, it also could be that high BPD people generally report avoidance. Like, there's lots of studies that say that people who are higher in BPD features report more avoidance. Now, it could simply be that they do that because it actually works, right? It could be that when they do something that involves avoiding their emotions, it actually works for them better than people who are lower in BPD. And we found this in a preliminary way for a study on self-harm, where we found that people with BPD who self-harmed were much more likely to report feeling relieved after self-harm than people without BPD who self-harmed. So if you take people who self-harm, and we looked at the BPD people, compared them to the no BPD people, they're more likely to feel relief. So maybe these avoidance strategies actually work better for them, and that's why they do them. So what's the next step? So the next step is that we're actually going to do this with a clinical sample. We just submitted a grant application to do this. And we're going to compare people with BPD from the community or who are in treatment to controls and to people with major depressive disorder, actually, and to see whether our findings hold up. We're actually going to get them to do it for 4 weeks rather than 4 days. And so instead of 4 days where 1 day is suppression, we're going to do it 4 weeks where 1 week is baseline, then suppression, observes, and baseline. And we're going to vary up the orders in which people do these things. We're also planning on including psychophysiology measures as well. So we're planning on hooking people up to these little devices where they can go about their day and it can measure their heart rate, their skin conductance, and other physiological measures of emotion. Because some research has actually suggested that suppressing emotions has a different effect on psychophysiology than it does on what people report about their emotions. And that it's more likely to increase their psychophysiology measures of negative emotions than it is to increase what they say about their emotions. And so what we're actually going to do is get people to walk around with these devices and that's measuring their physiology. And what we're going to also do is to make this more similar to what actually happens in therapy is that we're going to spend more time teaching them to actually do the skill we're suggesting. So we're going to spend more time teaching them to how to observe their emotions or how to suppress their emotions and try and make sure they're not distracting instead of really suppressing. What this actually gets at is a line of research that I think we actually have to focus a lot more on, which is how and why do specific treatment interventions that we recommend to people work in people's daily lives? Because that's where we're hoping to make the biggest impact. I think that's certainly something that all 3 people would have agreed during the treatment panel, is that we want people to change what's happening for them in their daily lives. We want people to have more fulfilling daily lives. We want them to be less distressed in their daily life and more able to cope. And I think that doing this kind of research has a lot of promise in getting us there, is actually looking at what happens in real life when people cope in certain ways. Thank you.